Hey there, this is Hannah, Chief Rebel at DeSkills. Imagine your high schooler could learn to harness artificial intelligence to solve real world problems for small businesses and nonprofits. Imagine they could get paid doing these impact projects on the weekends or summer break. And imagine that as a result, they could leave high school with more experience and connections than most college graduates. That's DeSkills. Learn more at deskills.io. That's dskills.io.
This podcast is funded by Ted Dintersmith, the executive producer of the acclaimed film Most Likely to Succeed, and the author of the best-selling book What School Could Be.
Hey everyone, welcome to the What School Could Be podcast. I'm your host, Josh Rapoon. Before we start the show, please check out all the resources at whatschoolcouldbe.org and our global online community. If you are a committed education change agent ready to roll up your sleeves and reimagine teaching and learning, simply install the What School Could Be app on your mobile device or navigate to community.whatschoolcouldbe.org. I hope to see you there. Listeners, Real World Learning is a Kansas City initiative incubated at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation in partnership with the community that works to prepare its region, students, and employers for the future. Through immersive experiences like projects and internships with leading employer partners, students get a head start on achieving their career goals at an early age. I learned about Real World Learning through its facilitator at the Kauffman Foundation, educator in residence, Bill Nicely. Eventually, after being knocked out by what Real World Learning was doing in the Kansas City area, I asked Bill to name someone to be a guest on this show. He named Sarah Renfrow, who teaches at Ray-Peck High School and works as a consultant for the Kauffman Foundation. Bill Nicely wrote the following about Sarah for today's episode. Quote, "True master teachers are an amazing gift. And even knowing this, to say that Sarah Renfrow is a master teacher is to make a significant understatement. Sarah is, of course, a master teacher, one of the best I've observed. She is also a master teacher of teachers, the best I've observed. Her understanding of how to strategically integrate client-connected projects into core content high school courses is amazing. But it is her ability to help teachers do the same that is her true talent. When done well, integrated client-connected projects are synonymous with competency-based learning and can very quickly become overcomplicated and burdensome for teachers. Sarah's real skill lies in simplifying the process to manageable pieces while conveying a low-pressure, just-try-it disposition. The result for teachers is that they not only learn a new and better way to engage students, they also find themselves equally engaged themselves, especially as they transition from teacher to facilitator of learning. All the while, Sarah, in a whispering kind of way, checks for understanding and moves to the next step in the process. Before you know it, teachers are implementing with fidelity and students are not only learning content, they are discovering new things about themselves and the world around them. It is this approach and her talent that has helped to catalyze the Kansas City's Real World Learning Initiative. Someday, when we step back and ask ourselves, how did this initiative take hold to benefit so many students? One response will surely be, we had Sarah Renfrow. During my prep for this episode, Sarah provided a couple gratitude letters students wrote to her. One student said of Sarah, "The ways you teach and help your students grow is a gift that no other teacher in my life has had." Another student wrote, "How in the world can I describe Mrs. Sarah Renfrow? I could say I see you as a massive role model in my life, or that you created an entire program from one of your ideas, but there is way more to say than just that. Mrs. Renfrow, you are one of a kind. I have always believed that. I have never met someone similar to you, and I think that is because I am a mini version of you, and I am so incredibly grateful." In a letter of support to the committee deciding on Ray-Peck's Teacher of the Year award, one of Sarah's colleagues wrote the following wonderful words, quote, "She has the ability to meet students where they are, make them feel relevant and respected for being in that place, and then engage them to get to a better place," end quote. That is high praise indeed. And now, here is my conversation with Master Teacher of Teachers, Sarah Renfrow. Sarah, welcome to the What School Could Be podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Sarah, you shared a story with me, which I loved, about young Sarah Renfrow, the reader and the writer in school. And in short, you figured out very early in your life that you love to read, you love to write, and you absolutely did not want to be called on or called out in front of your peers. So rather, you craved individual feedback sessions or conversations where you could demonstrate your learning. So there's some irony here that I am calling on you at this moment in front of a lot of listeners, but there you go. I would love for you to explain the connection between your love of reading, writing, and conversation. Like, what do our listeners need to know about this essential element of Sarah Renfrow?
I learned very early on in my education that in order for me to be able to engage with what I was doing, I not only needed to be able to process through it through writing or through the assignments that I was given, but to be able to process it through conversation meant a whole lot to me. And I think ever since my friends and colleagues have gotten the brunt of that, being able to burst in on them and start writing on a whiteboard or just to be able to talk through something, because even if I'm able to map it out on paper or to try to get the right words for it, I certainly want some feedback and often just to be able to say the same words over and over again until it sounds correct to me really lets me move on with my thinking or move on to the next idea. The other part of that that's always just been so important is there's so many ideas and feelings floating around in the
Mm.
way that we engage with the world that there's been so many points in my life that I've had a feeling about something so much sooner than I've had the words for it. And I just really appreciate those people in my life, whether that's directly through conversation or to be able to listen to a podcast or read something that have given me the words to articulate that feeling or what it is that feels like would be right or the next step to move forward.
Mm. You know, what's so cool is, Sarah, is that I'm discovering, now you're going to be the 127th episode of this show, how many times it sort of feels like I'm in direct alignment with a guest. Like, I was extremely shy as a kid, but I loved writing and I loved reading. And I just was terrified that I would be called on in class. You couldn't get me to speak if you threatened me. And I remember that there was this one class that I took, and it was actually in the middle of high school, a U.S. history class. And this teacher had figured out that one of the ways to engage students was to sort of develop a point system around reading secondary sources in history. And he gave me my first book, which was Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And I tore through that thing. But the trick was that you had to demonstrate your learning by going in and sitting down with him and having a conversation about it. Oh, man, that was just the best. And I wonder that our system of education, I would love your thoughts on this, can handle something like that. Like, what are the possibilities? What are the potentials for that sort of feedback, given how many students we typically end up having as teachers? It's a hard problem.
Yeah, absolutely. My answer is, oh man, I hope that we can handle it. I hope that's what we're moving toward. I have a similar story as a student. When I would be taking a test, I would be so terrified that the teacher was going to write my name on the board as one of the students that did so well that I would answer some of the wrong questions, but I didn't want the teacher to be disappointed in me. So I would turn the paper over and write the correct answers upside down so that she would know that I was capable of doing that. So I was willing to communicate with her where I was. I just didn't want it broadcast everywhere. And learning is such a personal experience that I think that we have to move toward this conversation with students.
Mm.
And I think that what that looks like is to put everything in front of the students. If they know the language around what it is that they're supposed to be learning, and first you have conversations about that, but then you're able to divide out time in a way that you're able to just sit next to a student and listen to what they have to say. Or if that's not possible, when they're submitting work, there is a space to say, here's why
Mm.
I gave this answer, or here's why I wrote it this way. I myself have never been so frustrated as I've been when I've been taking tests that were just multiple choice.
Yeah.
And then I would be using so much critical thinking as I was looking at the answers and almost second guessing myself because of the depth of information that I had. That if I had been able to say, here's why I chose this answer, I think that a teacher would have been able to see my mastery of
Mm.
the idea much clearer.
Yeah, I felt the same way, especially in the humanities and English courses and history courses when I was in school. In my mind, as I was doing multiple choice tests, I would be screaming in my mind saying, this is so subjective. Like, how could you write a question like this? But of course, trying to stay calm while I was sitting in my seat. But anyway, okay. So Sarah, you shared that two jobs you held during college, one at a truck stop, one at a grocery store, taught you a great deal about who folks are, what they know, and what they value. So I wonder if you can draw the line, straight or squiggly, between these years and your understanding of the patience it takes to work with young learners and fellow educators in education spaces. Like, I wonder if you can draw the line straight or squiggly between the truck stop and the grocery store and your understanding that every kid and every teacher or coach has a story and it is worth knowing it.
Yeah, I think it's such a human thing to categorize anything that we encounter. And that, of course, includes humans. And we sort of have a visceral reaction to people, sometimes in a negative way and sometimes in a positive way. And we want to see what we recognize and put people into boxes and set our expectations for them. And I was very lucky to be in these spaces where originally I was uncomfortable to work overnight, at a truck
Mm.
stop where very grisly looking men would come in, but then would happily sit and tell these long, in depth stories about their life. And often I would meet professors that had given up that job to become truck drivers because of the freedom of the road or what it meant to their family, et cetera. And I've just carried that with me.
Mm.
Students are put into particular classes, sometimes only based on what they've produced in the past, but sometimes because they haven't been challenged or because nobody's asked them the right question or sat down to have that right conversation that gets them interested in what it is that's going on in the class around them. So I've always just tried to carve out space to try to ask those questions or to sit and listen a little bit and maybe overhear a conversation that might give me that right question to ask a student to find out what it is that drives them or
Mm.
is part of their story.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I sort of remember back when I first started teaching, and that was in the mid 90s, there was a moment. I mean, as a typical young teacher, you come in and you think that every student is just a vessel to be filled up with information. But there was a moment when it started to dawn on me, Sarah, that my students were walking, talking stories and that they had lives that they were living. And I remember, I don't remember specific stories about specific kids, but I remember starting to get that feeling that there was something different going on, as a process of understanding that. And I wonder, like, did that happen for you early on as a teacher, or did you kind of know that right away, that all of your students were stories? And even later when you're teaching teachers, that they're also, living stories that are walking around?
I think that that's definitely one of those examples of a feeling that I had long before I had the words to articulate it. I came
Mm.
out of college with the same education that teachers get, and I was focused on how do I write a great multiple choice question, which is the answer to that, to be clear, is I don't. But I was focused on how I could be a great teacher instead of how I could serve the students. And I had to learn from those teachers around me that were just really fantastic about recognizing all of our students are fully formed human beings before they step into our doorway. And it's not our job to fill them up. It's our job to, learn where they're at and then meet them where they are with whatever resources we have that takes them to their next step to fulfill whatever their goals are.
Yeah, I love that. And going back to the point of the question, which is about being, working at a truck stop or at a grocery store, it seems like, and maybe I'm painting with a broad brush here, but educators who have rich and interesting lives outside of education or come from backgrounds that aren't necessarily education sort of have that feeling already because they've been, interacting with humans and building relationships with humans. And that helps you to get to that point. So that's awesome. So slight left turn here, Sarah. At the beginning of your career as a teacher, you were handed the keys to a theater/auditorium. What were the circumstances? What was the context? And like, what happened next after you got the keys? Like, how was this moment the start of what you described with some humor as being the process of being a terrible teacher over and over and over again?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to give credit to my parents. Whatever they did instilled something in me that just made me feel like I was going to be fine no matter what.
Hmm.
So when I decided to apply for jobs late in the summer, not thinking I should do it any earlier, and found this open theater job without any type of qualifications to be doing that other than being in a couple of plays in high school.
Hmm.
It felt overwhelming, but I didn't, for some reason, have any fear about it. Taking those keys and walking into the auditorium and starting to dig through things to
Wow.
figure out what it is that I needed to do. And that's the great thing is you get to see students in their element when they realize that you don't know any more than they do. I wish I could replicate that more successfully than I do because the older I get, they confer some type of wisdom onto me without me earning it.
Hmm.
But at the time I was lost and they had more experience there than I did. So they very quickly in some ways were protecting me and wanted to make sure that I didn't look silly and just did everything they could to let me know what they had experience in. But it was just a learning journey together to figure out how do we put on a play. I mean, I was Googling it. How do you put on a play?
Wow.
and and then diving right into that with their support.
So do you have any specific memories about like what was the first piece of theater? What was the first production that you worked with your students? Do you have specific memories about that?
Yeah, we did You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. And that first year, luckily a small cast, but I was teaching stagecraft. I didn't know at the time that you could say to whoever was assigning classes, I shouldn't be teaching that. And our method of building was researched some safety methods on power tools and looked to see what we had and let the kids try to build things and then jump on them to see if they were sturdy enough to use.
Hmm.
And we, painted things and I Googled how to block a scene and we went from there. So it was just great to see students think, well, this person can't direct at all. Maybe I'll be their quote unquote assistant director and handle this for them, but then take such ownership of that role to feel like they need to pass it on to the next student. So they would identify a younger student. My seniors would start to identify these freshmen and say, I think this person's going to be good for that. And then just get them so invested in that role that then they would stay for 4 years. I was at that school for 12 years and had 3 stage managers because they all stayed for 4 years apiece.
Wow. That's such a great story, Sarah. And I'm thinking we're going to talk about project-based learning in a second, but I wonder now in this moment, I don't know that the words were there for you, but were you realizing that you were deep into project-based learning at that point?
Yeah, I was able to see that what was happening on the stage was working in a way that what was happening in the classroom wasn't. And
Hmm.
I could tell that I was pulling teeth in the classroom where students on the stage were enthusiastically learning. And even in my drama class during the day, I didn't have the same enthusiasm for the students that were giving up their time after school to do it.
Hmm.
So I was already trying to think about how to bridge that gap without knowing what direction to go in.
And was there sort of a point where you realized that, like, or well, let me put it this way, that you were sort of drawing comparisons to your own schooling experience back in middle school and high school, and that what you were doing here as you were kind of grasping your way through this moment, that this was quite different than what you had experienced?
Yes, definitely. I spent my middle school and the beginning of my high school career in a much more traditional space. And I would be enthralled by those teachers that had a skill that I don't have, which is lecturing and could tell stories in a way that would bring
Mm,
me in. And I certainly, especially my eighth grade year, I had a teacher named Mr. Bradford who would talk to me about my stories and the writing that I was doing. And I knew that that felt so fantastic and really compelled me to continue the writing that I was doing or think about how I could do it better. But I didn't become more self reflective on it until I had been teaching for a few years about how I could bring those pieces in.
yeah.
And then certainly looking back to that high school experience when I transferred schools to a much smaller private school and was lucky, very lucky, that they couldn't offer me some of the classes that I could have. And they sort of had to scramble to find experiences to fill my day.
Mm,
And I just ended up in a very personalized schooling experience
mm.
I felt quite entitled to at the time, and later on realized that it was my responsibility to try to recreate that for my students as much as possible.
Yeah, yeah, that's super interesting. So, one more question before we go to our first break. This question, Sarah, comes directly from your resume. Let me read the line that kind of sent me into near orbit. Quote, coordinated the ongoing writing and implementation of project based curriculum for up to 10 English 4 sections, including in person, hybrid, and virtual courses, end quote. So I'm going to bet my wallet that practically no one in education puts the words English for sections and project based learning into the same sentence, nor would they add something called client connected projects to the mix. So you did this. So our listeners want to know both the why and the how. Like, how does project based learning bring teaching English to life? What is a specific example of a student or some students in an English course connecting to clients and working on projects?
Wow.
I know it's a big one.
Uh, the great thing about English is it is everything that we do. So when we're thinking about bringing projects into the English for classroom, first of all, these are the students that are the most ready for it. Oftentimes, they're not the ones that we are pulling the novels away from their grasping hands.
Mm,
Certainly, those don't go away. But the question is, how do we, if we're saying that what we're teaching in English is relevant in their lives, how do we show them that that is the case?
mm,
So, some of the most successful projects that we had in English for were district level projects. And that's because those students very often were so closely tied to their community that for them to be able to see how they were able to change a district that they felt that they hadn't had much impact on in the past really made a difference to them. So, for instance, one of the projects that students really connected with right away was when our director of secondary education asked them about our course guide and
mm,
said, how can we make this better? And the students very quickly honed in on how much they disliked it and felt very excited to be able to have the audience to say what was wrong with it. It was confusing and they weren't sure how they were supposed to follow their path and the pages that were set out for that weren't making sense to them and they didn't know how to navigate their way through that.
mm,
So
mm,
in order for them to be able to do well, first of all, they had to very closely read that in order to be able to express their opinions on it. But in order to be able to survey fellow students to get specific feedback on what was working or not working, I mean, those are their stakeholders right away. And then to be able to ask those close ended and open ended questions and use critical thinking on those responses to gather that into a report that helps them define what their problem is, and then cite both primary and secondary resources to support what it is that they're saying.
Hmm.
They're doing everything that we ask them to do in English class, but they're doing it for something that is making an immediate change that they're able to see.
Wow. That story about the course catalog, if you will, is just such a great story. I mean, it's somebody, not the students who are, that person is sort of identifying a potential, gap of some sort, a gap of understanding. And then here's this opportunity for the students to work on this. And of course they dive in because they've been empowered to dive in. I wonder, Sarah, like, what was the process? And I know that this is over a long period of time, but what was the process of constructing projects? Like, on one side, it's, the adults, the teachers, the coaches who are coming up with ideas. On the other side, there's students who are coming up with ideas. Like, how did that work in the context of this, English 4, but you could expand it in any way you want?
Yeah, I really had to think about it. I think that background in theater made a difference because
Mm,
I didn't have to relearn how to put on a play every time I started doing a new play. There was a process for it.
yeah.
And so the first thing that we had to think about, if you're bringing on that many teachers and that many students, is what is that scalable process that can be repeated without repeating projects over and over again. So we had to create a system that you could drop almost any project into, where students were able to create the artifacts that could be used to demonstrate their learning in English, while at the same time flexible enough to be able to deliver to their clients what it is that they needed to do. So we did have to brainstorm a little bit, what could some projects look like before we had the answers to that. But I was very lucky to work with our director of community partnerships, who
Mm,
was brought on at that time that we were pivoting to the projects, who really had that business sense of what some of our community partners might be looking for, whether they're businesses, nonprofits, religious entities, recreational facilities, whoever it might be that we're working for. How could we get them to bring us these open ended problems for
mm,
students to solve,
mm.
rather than focusing on what the end product could be? And this is a practice that's helpful not just for client connected projects, but just for teachers in general. I think we've kind of bought into this backwards design where a teacher gets very excited for how they've envisioned an end goal to be. But when you approach a student with any kind of assignment, whether it's a project or not, and you've already zeroed in on what it's going to look like at the end,
Yeah.
students very quickly know that they don't have a lot of creativity, that the question's already been answered, and they're going to lose interest pretty quickly. So we have to ask our clients to be very committed to responding to what the students bring them.
Yeah. That's awesome.
I mean, in the real world, very often the client, you said like our director of secondary education had identified that we needed a new course guide, but she had certainly come in with an idea of what that might look like. But once the students did their empathy work, they had a slightly different problem to solve. So that end goal sometimes looks quite different than what a client had brought to them. And we hope that their research supports going in a different direction in a way that it does, but that's the real world as well. They can pitch more than one idea and then the client can decide what direction to go in.
Wow, love that. And I'll share really quick before we go to break, just a quick story that I spoke with a young high school student last week. I had been invited to a high school here in Hawaii where I'm based to just observe some internships basically, and they were doing their showcase of learning. And there was this one young woman who was interning at a car dealership. And she had a wonderful presentation. And I guess she'd done a number of things at this car dealership and even gotten a part-time job there. But after it was over, Sarah, I kind of pulled her aside and I asked her, like, if you were to identify like one problem that you would love to solve as part of your internship, what would that be? And she said, oh, I know that one right away. What I would want to do is to build a series of learning modules so that this business would actually have a process for bringing on interns. She said there was no plan for the interns. And I thought, oh my God, that's brilliant. That's just brilliant, right? So, and if we're talking about English, then here she would be writing up those modules and doing all the things that would be necessary to help kids come on board as interns, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You've got an authentic audience that you're writing to, you're solving a problem for them, you're, thinking about how you're appealing to their emotions and bringing them on board. Absolutely. That's what they want, that's what we want.
Yeah.
Isn't it funny that students can often identify the problems around them and they're willing to solve them if we just bother to ask?
Yes, absolutely. Awesome. So, hey, everyone, we've been talking to Sarah Renfrow in Kansas City. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
What does the future of learning look like? All the big changes going on in tech and society these days are raising tough and fascinating questions about education and where it's going. We dig into those questions every week on the EdSurge podcast. I'm Jeff Young, an editor and a reporter at EdSurge, and I sit down with educators, students, and scholars for frank and in-depth conversations about how education is changing. You can find the EdSurge podcast wherever you listen, or just go to edsurge.com and click on the podcast link. I hope you'll check it out.
Hi, I'm Ricardo.
I'm Mary.
And I'm Liz.
And we co-host Course Stories, a podcast produced by the Instructional Design and New Media team at Arizona State University.
In this podcast, we tell an array of course design stories alongside other ASU online designers and faculty.
Join us as we talk to the course design experts about shaping the future of online education. Tune into Course Stories, where innovation meets instruction.
Find us wherever you listen to podcasts.
Course Stories!
Perfection.
Hi, friends. This is Toy Hirschman from EntreEd. It is my great honor to uplift this excellent podcast, What School Could Be. As always, we are super excited to support innovation in education. We've been lucky enough to feature some of the incredible What School Could Be educators on our podcast. If you are looking to be inspired by entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial educators and other great minds from across the world, check out the EntreEd Talk podcast, and please like and subscribe and leave a review. Thanks for tuning in.
Hey, everyone. We are back with Sarah Renfrow, who was awarded the Pedagogical Pioneer Award at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation's Get on the Bus event early in 2024. So Sarah, inspired by Guy Raz, the host of the How I Built This and Wow in the World podcasts, I'm going to do something pretty crazy here. So Guy Raz is a super eloquent spokesperson for the idea of pure audio in learning. And he notes that video often becomes an addiction for kids, but audio sparks the brain into creativity. So I watched a 3-minute video I found online that is essentially a drone flight through an artist's rendering of the Ray-Pec High School's Lead Center, funded by the Kauffman Foundation, which has been your educator's home for the past few years. So for this radio audience, Sarah, noting your keen sense of the power of words and the human voice, I want you to fly us through the Lead Center in the same 3 minutes, roughly. We are going to close our eyes and listen to you bring Lead to life. And by the way, for those of you who are driving right now, do not close your eyes, please. Okay, so Sarah, ready, set, go.
So approaching the Lead Center from a bird's-eye view in the early morning, a soft light emits from the light bulb perched above 4 letters on the entrance sign, promising learning, experiences, and discovery for anyone who enters. It's only a slight dip to step through the entrance, and you may be struck by the contrast between the sturdiness of the concrete structure that used to house a farm and home store and the lightness of the open space, highlighted by a massive windows and a pop of orange color greeting you. A second set of doors opens to a huge array of workspaces, differentiated only by various seating options from upholstered patterned benches to a set of chairs that look like seats at the helm of the Starship Enterprise, only they're situated at the bottom of glossy learning stairs, perfect for group presentations, that lead up to a mezzanine overlooking the center, where student teams can pull up seats and roll over a whiteboard to argue about their latest idea. On one side of the stairs, 2 conference rooms encased in glass are stacked atop each other, welcoming a community partner to a meeting or housing students practicing their next business presentation. A set of stairs leads down to an area papered with sharp printouts of logos, where students wearing headphones zoom in on a scene they're editing or grab a camera to head outdoors to film some content. In the center of the room, under the exposed gray ceiling structure, sit tall butcher block tables surrounded by wooden cabinets and clear drawers, housing a collection of art, craft, building, and printing supplies that bring out the tinker in everyone who enters. The sound of drilling punctuates the steady hum of noise. Nearby double doors open to sawhorses splayed out in the center of the room, displaying carpentry projects in various levels of completion. If you're lucky to visit on a day they aren't at their placements, you can peer in the windows atop a row of countertop seating to see what the Teacher Academy is up to, often hosting a guest speaker from a nearby college or hard at work designing materials for their classrooms, filling the room with color. You'll soon happen upon the coffee shop. A large screen displays the latest prototype of an original seasonal drink, and you may be tempted to drop some change in the tip jar on the counter or settle into some bistro-style seating. Stepping to the back of the building will bring you first to the corner storefront, hosting displays of students' businesses on shelves and racks. A massive industrial space lined by overhead doors lets the sunlight in on a series of electrical booths where students run wire for their latest projects as their instructor, a master electrician, holds a measuring tape up to their work. Circling around and pushing through a series of doors will allow you to step into the machining shop. And while you may first note the noise that was protected by soundproof glass, you'll next hone in on the concentration these students give to their meticulous work on the drill press, mill, or lathe as bits of metal softly drift to the floor. Passing back through the entrance, it's impossible to escape the feeling that you've just opened a fresh set of crayons or peeled off the lid of a gallon of paint, and it's inevitable that you'll walk away with the urge to create something.
Wow. You had me at Starship Enterprise or the bridge of it. Wow, that's so amazing. So, Sarah, I'm just going to go straight into the next question because it's also about the Lead Center. You shared with me, and I understand that there were 3 key individuals responsible for the vision behind the Lead Center at Ray-Pec High School, including programming and staffing. And in particular, Dr. Christelle Barr made visits to what we might call micro schools, plus programs like Iowa Big to see what was possible and gain inspiration. And you were given autonomy to design and implement in the Lead Center, which you just beautifully described, something called Enterprise and Design. And on its face, this is remarkable given you taught English literature, drama, speech, and debate, etc. So pick up the story as you were finishing the blueprints, if you will, for Enterprise and Design and getting ready to implement it. Like, paint us a picture of that moment.
Oh, wow. So, thinking about enterprise and design, I think I was always hearkening back to that experience backstage at the theater and trying to think how students interested in so many different avenues could have that feeling of being able to pursue whatever their goals looked like. And the structure of that definitely came out from conversations with so many different people and visits to places like Iowa Big to see how they had implemented it. So ultimately, the vision was, how do you give up freedom to students to design what their day looks like and what their learning looks like around these client connected projects that we had in place?
Wow. It's a massive question about how you give up that freedom, right? And so I wonder, what it was like as the very beginning of that implementation took place, as you began to develop this. What was that like? What was happening at that time? Paint us a picture of that.
So when we were beginning to implement what that looked like, the first thing that we had to do as teachers was to be able to look at what giving up freedom looks like. We were all accustomed to sitting in a classroom where bells were ringing, and that gave just a natural structure, or an unnatural structure, I should say, to the day. And we had to talk about what was happening in our classes. So I, of course, am an English teacher. We have a media teacher who had been doing work similar to this throughout her career. And very soon we were bringing on business teacher and social studies teacher, and had to think about what were the main elements of what they were doing and how did we deliver that to students. And so we had to start with the technology first. We had our learning management system that students were familiar with navigating, and we had to really push that to think about how do we make this operate differently and maybe do some things that we hadn't been asking it to do before. We needed to be able to communicate where students were going to be able to showcase their work. And then we very quickly had to start prototyping and testing that with students and being willing to make those changes very quickly to meet what it was that they were giving us or how they were talking about it. And then how did we manage that workload? When did we need to walk up to students to talk to them? When were we giving feedback online? When did we need to do some direct instruction, whether that was just of our processes or, letting them practice what it was going to look like to sit down with a client. And I always just try to err toward backing away and seeing what students can do and then filling in the blanks rather than trying to anticipate what they might need to know because they inevitably surprise us.
Okay, so perfect segue then to my next question. You shared with me some interesting insights into what happens when Sarah Renfrow notices and acts on a problem. So rather than talking about this from sort of a Shark Tank or entrepreneurial perspective, I want to talk about what it takes to develop what is called the designer's mindset, which has kind of become a buzz phrase in education, but I think it is worthy of attention. So in your lead center and during the development of enterprise and design and your work for Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City around real-world learning, in what ways are you and your fellow educators, the administrators you are working with, your students, their parents, the businesses you are working with, developing a sort of design your life mindset in thousands of kids? This is kind of a fishing expedition and I'm making assumptions, but that was overwhelming to me as I was working through my prep, Sarah, was that a sort of design your life cultural shift was underway or began at some point and is now fully underway. And I wonder if you can share some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I hope I'm not repeating myself. I think that anytime that you're trying to move students and teachers toward that design mindset of thinking about what something could look like without committing yourself to what the end product looks like, the first thing that you have to teach everyone is the power in letting go of control.
Yeah.
And it was Stephanie Russ, who I work with daily, my partner in learning and teaching, who was the first one to bring up this idea of abandoning that backwards design principle as far as putting it in front of students.
Yeah.
And you want to challenge teachers to give that up too. I think when we're working in that backwards model, we're designing what does the next step look like? And nobody is designing that way. We're completing steps. We're doing a how-to model when we do that. So when you're thinking about onboarding teachers to this type of process and then asking them to onboard students to that type of process, you really just have to say, you must decide and communicate what is necessary, almost that what are your deliverables, not the end goal, but what must the final thing include? And the answer to that is often whatever your course goals are or whatever essential skills you're trying to teach through the process. And then you have to start thinking about, how do I open the door to these things without dictating how they happen? And that's an interesting but difficult conversation to have. But you also want to turn the reins over, much like we do to the students, to those teachers that have the experience in the subject area that they're teaching. They have it. Very oftentimes, everyone just needs permission to use it. And when you give that to them, you can just step back and learn and, gather the pictures of their stories and then use those for the next iteration.
So, along the journey, what are the ways? I think I would just love a little bit more clarity on what are the ways that learning is captured and showcased, which are two very different things. Because you can be capturing learning in some very interesting and creative ways, very organic ways, but you may not necessarily have come to that idea of showcasing learning. And it sounds like everything that's happening, continues to happen in the Lead Center, Sarah, but also with real world learning and client connected projects and all of that. There's an element of capturing the learning along the way, but there's also moments of showcase, which, by the way, you shared some videos with me, which I watched of these showcases. So I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the difference between the two is when you're able to engage in conversation about the learning with the student. So
Mm,
giving them an opportunity to, produce an artifact and submit that, but also pair that with a reflection of their learning to be able to explain why they think that that's an excellent artifact of their learning really lets you enter into that conversation and see where you're coming from. As an English teacher, that gave me a lot of freedom to not have to search through a paper and try to decide what I think the student thinks that their thesis statement, right, might be,
yeah.
because I'm asking them to point it out to me and go through their thinking process. And it opens the door for me to much more easily hone in on where, the breakdown of learning might be or the breakdown of understanding might be and where I need to meet them in that next conversation or where I might just very quickly, link to a resource that would answer the question for them. And then they're able to move forward. So to me, that documentation of learning, that's what that looks like. It's the beginning of a conversation. Whereas the showcase is that control of the story that we give to the student
Yeah.
to articulate what their goals were and how well they met them and where the next step is. It actually might have been a previous guest on your podcast that I really liked how they talked about what mastery of learning is.
Mm,
And those were words I'd been waiting for, right? Because I kept trying to say, what makes this mastery and how mastered do you have to be before you have mastered it? And terrible words to try to use. But to be able to say, oh, when the student is capable of having a conversation about whether or not they've mastered it, right? Like they are able to conceptually discuss the concept that we're talking about. Like, even if they didn't create an artifact that did it, if they're able to talk about how the artifact did not meet it, they're starting to get mastery of that product.
yeah, love that. And one of the videos that you shared with me were these 4 students talking about developing a bike lane in a particular urban area. And it was fascinating to watch that because I was just listening really carefully, like, what was the purpose of what they were doing and in what ways were they articulating it to me, the watcher, the listener, and all of that. And was there a level of mastery? And for me, it came through very loud and clear, like they had figured out what the whole bike lane thing was all about. And they really knew it backwards and forwards. And the artifact is that piece of video that actually shows them together, the 4 of them, beautifully coordinated, talking about that. So that's very cool. Okay, so Sarah, I'm going to squeeze in one more question before we go to our second break. This one has to do with artificial intelligence. So 2-part question, and I apologize for abruptly forcing 2 things together that might not belong together. Maybe you can make them belong to each other. So in your opinion, what is this is huge, and I apologize for that. In your opinion, what is the purpose of any English class at any middle or high school level? And why, part 2, are you excited by the entrance of artificial intelligence in English courses?
I mean, the purpose of any English class is to teach students how to navigate the world and to be able to communicate clearly, to listen to different ideas, to consume information, to parse through it neatly, and then to be able to synthesize that information and come up with new ideas that they can move forward with.
Hmm.
And AI is like the calculator for English.
Hmm.
It very simply summarizes information. We used to focus a lot on having students spend some time summarizing information. I did a lot of literature review writing in my day. And while taking the time to do the research for that and understanding that and really inspecting the ideas behind that is part of that process and is still very important. When you're just generating summaries, like AI is taking a lot off of our plates. Now,
Hmm.
what we need to focus on then is teaching students to be able to then look at what's been created and question whether or not is this valid? Are these conclusions being drawn by AI really reflective of what's in the literature,
Hmm.
or what is out there? And I think AI is still a far ways away from that, but to be able to have that conversation with students about the technology as they dive in and start to ask those questions, that's our job, is to help them navigate that world. And that's the world that's going to be out there. And so we've really got to step up our game as far as that goes.
Yeah, love that, Sarah. I'm so struck in this moment. Here we are a year and a half after the launch of ChatGPT from OpenAI, that there are these opportunities that now exist for students not to work alone, but actually to have a partner. It just turns out that the partner is an artificial intelligence. But nevertheless, it's still a partner, and you still have to develop a relationship with it. And you have to figure out how it becomes your partner as you move forward and express yourself and exist in the world as you described, the purpose of English. So I think we're at the beginning of something very interesting and, to me, quite hopeful. I know there's some downsides for sure and some guardrails that have to go into place, but I love the potential here. So, hey everyone, stay with us. We've been talking to Sarah Renfrow, coming to us from Kansas City, and we will be right back.
Hi, fellow educators. I'm Steve Shapiro, and like you, I'm excited about the possibilities of what school could be. Please check out my podcast, Experience Matters, where I talk to guests ranging from big national thinkers like Daniel Pink and Tony Wagner to recent high school graduates about the most profound learning experiences of their youth. Then we dig into the implications for how we can reshape schools to produce powerful breakthrough learning for all of our students. Education can take many forms, but whatever form it takes, experience matters.
Hey there. Are you interested in hearing weekly conversations with authors, leaders, and practitioners at the forefront of learning and education innovation? Then you'll love the Getting Smart podcast. This podcast amplifies the incredible work being done by some of the most innovative minds in education. Learn new leadership styles, new technologies, new frameworks and mindsets, and get the fuel you need to stay motivated and curious. Together, we can empower all learners to thrive. It's available at gettingsmart.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Are you ready to shake things up in the classroom? Then get ready to blast off into the future of education with the Teacher Nerds podcast. Join Joe DiPaolo and Ron Nober as they share their own experiences, as well as talk with guests who are experts and innovators in education. From engaging teaching techniques to the latest educational technology, this podcast is a must-listen for anyone passionate about the future of learning. Subscribe and get ready to learn with the Teacher Nerds podcast.
Hey everyone, we are back with Sarah Renfrow, who lives in two worlds, the RAPEC Lead Center and the Kauffman Foundation's Real World Learning Initiative. So Sarah, while at the University of Central Missouri, you wrote a paper titled Implementing Personalized Learning in the 9 through 12 environment. And the first line of that paper, which I read, goes like this, quote, 200 years ago, personalized learning was the preferred method of instruction in the United States. Instructors grouped students by competencies and worked with individuals and small groups, allowing students to progress at their own pace into the next lesson, end quote. So here in 2024, to what extent does the Kauffman Foundation's Real World Learning Initiative, which you are deeply a part of, involve personalized learning? And I know that might seem obvious as a question, but I wanted to kind of frame it in the context of the paper that you wrote. Like, how is this initiative a model of perhaps personalized learning and its implementation?
So I think that working on real world learning is the framework of moving back toward personalized learning. When I was doing the research for that paper, I was so sad to read that. I had no idea how far we'd come,
Hmm.
maybe going what I would think was the right direction. But I think anytime that we're going to do such a widespread initiative, like that's the time to make the change as far as our processes and what it is that we're doing when we're teaching students. And if we're able to break apart the pieces of learning that we're doing, and we must do that when we're thinking about how to take the methods of teaching that we're using, or even abandoning some of the methods of teaching that we're using and thinking about what does that look like in the real world. It's so interesting because we have capital R, capital W, real world learning,
Yeah.
but we have the learning that we do every day in our everyday lives. And it's not hard to duplicate that because it's something that we do so naturally. If I
Mm.
want to learn more about it, I've got the internet at my fingertips. I need to be armed with the ability to assess what is good and bad information, but it's there. And we've been so slow to adopt how to, or just to be able to adapt to what's out there and how to help guide students through all of these resources that are already out there, but they do it every day. So once again, where are those places that we can step back and have students show us how they do that so that then I can think about how I change the way that I'm teaching to support the way that you're learning something, right? I don't know anything about this. Where do I go first to learn about it? What does that look like for me? And then how do I make your research strategies stronger or your critical thinking stronger as you're diving into that? That's where personalized learning comes in. And again, teachers have such a depth of knowledge in their content area, and they've created so many resources, and we have access to so many resources that as we switch over to just guiding students through navigating through those resources or knowing when to apply them, that's where we have a greater impact on not just what's happening in our classrooms, but what's happening with the way that young people navigate the world, because they're going to take those strategies out of the classroom into different content area. They're going to be able to transfer it into all areas of their lives. So if we can just agree that we're willing to step back and look at what a student is doing and what they need and respond to that rather than try to anticipate it, we're doing personalized learning quite easily.
Yeah, perfect. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into the educator side of this, Sarah. So as we've talked about, you have one foot in the Ray-Pec High School's Lead Center and its Enterprise and Design program, and one foot in the Kauffman Foundation's Client Connected Projects and Real World Learning Initiative, which is impacting, by the way, 80,000 students. So the Kauffman Foundation awarded you, as I mentioned earlier, its Pedagogical Pioneer Award at a Get on the Bus event this year in 2024. So I suspect, Sarah, that that might have had something to do with your training 13 master teachers and adding 80 teachers to the Client Connected Projects network. So what is that story? How did you train the master teachers? I think you were already kind of hinting at it here when we were talking about personalized learning, because personalized learning is part of every person's life, right? But what specifically were the processes and the methodologies that you were employing to train these master teachers and also to bring teachers on board?
Yeah, so what's interesting is really all my methodologies look very similar. So I think that it might seem that I'm being quite innovative, but it turns out that what works for human beings works for most human beings. And as a teacher myself, like I had been to so many conferences and, just professional development opportunities built for teachers that I was driven by really what's driven me throughout my whole life, which is a little bit of a frustration with the system that was already in place, because I would very often be sitting next to teachers who were carrying so much experience and ideas and ability to innovate with them, but we were kind of passively receiving information
Mm.
and not being given a lot of time to talk about it or to be able to dig into resources, or the resources were behind, paywalls or cost money to get to, or I had to be able to pay for a conference to get to them. And I found that really frustrating. So really where we started at Kauffman was to think about, what do teachers need? They actually don't need education in their field. They're bought into the work. I mean, when you talk to teachers about real world learning, it does not take long for them to become very bought into that work. They don't need to
Mm-hmm.
listen to how I did it
Mm.
necessarily or to hear my story. They'll always listen to student stories, but they've been in a classroom, they know what students need. And instead, we realized that they just needed to know, what pieces do I need to include?
Mm.
What makes something a valuable experience for students? And we were able to break that down, like not just your course content, but what essential skills are you building? Where are you incorporating student agency, elements like that? And then to say, hey, here's all the resources that we already have. What do you have?
Mm-hmm.
What else do you need? And then be able to respond to that. So all I asked master teachers to do is to think about how they can mentor other students through that, or other teachers through that process.
Mm.
What have you done? What was successful to you? What was not successful? And I think anytime we crown somebody with, you're going to be the master teacher or the mentor teacher, it feels like you're supposed to have all those answers, but we're not asking anyone to have all the answers. We're saying, let's sit down with a group of teachers with the resources, with the experiences we have, with these goals in mind. We need to incorporate these things and start to have a conversation about what that looks like and give teachers time to do that. And I think they've really been able to respond to that.
Wow, that's just gives me hope, Sarah. Really gives me hope, because I share those frustrations. And going back to, like, good grief, 200 years, really? We have to go 200 years before we figure out or find our way back to the most natural way that humans actually learn, which is a completely personalized pathway. Every single day, all day long, you're engaging in personalized learning. And so that's awesome. Okay, so as we come near the end of this awesome conversation, I want to return for a moment to your very first year teaching. And during that year in Missouri, you were dealing with either a district, I think, or a school policy that required, if that is the right word, that students not have their heads down in class for any reason. But something happened with one student that I think is important for our listeners to hear. What's that story? And in what ways does this story you're about to tell speak to the power dynamics between teachers and students and all of that complicated stuff?
Yeah, of course, this was an idea that I'm sure came from this idea that all students needed to be engaged.
Yeah.
And the idea that a student with their head down is not engaged, and that's certainly true in that moment, drove administration to say, if we're walking around, we better not see any students with their heads down. And as a first year teacher, I, took that very seriously.
Yeah.
And on this particular day, a student had his head down, and I, walked over and, tapped him on the back and said, please get your head up. And he responded, not physically violently, but obviously was very angry and was cursing and letting me know that I had no right to ask him to have his head up. And I remember in the moment, like, once again, not having the words to articulate how I felt that what I had done was wrong, because I didn't, and again, I didn't know, but I thought about it and didn't come to any answers immediately about what I should do. But the next day I approached a student and apologized. I mean, I had, I'm sure, I can't even remember, I probably had sent him to the office or something in the moment. But I said, I am so sorry. I didn't ask you what was wrong. I didn't talk to you in any way. And I just asked you to get your head up, and I won't do that again. And I not only saw the response in the student of how much, like, connection I had made with him in that moment, but the students around, who very often, if they know that about me now, will say, if I was, approaching a student, know that they can say to me, hey, here's what's going on with them. They're having a bad time. And I can give that student a little bit more space and a little bit more time to respond to what it is that I'm asking them to do. So yet another one of those times that, you're doing what you're being asked to do as an educator with that feeling of, I'm not sure this is what I should be doing. And I hope more and more teachers just become more empowered. And I do think social media is very helpful with that, to see how teachers are responding to different students' needs in individualized ways, to allow themselves to think about, is what I'm being asked to do right for students? And how can I empower myself to question that or try to make a change in the current system? Because I don't want my students to experience what we've set up for them currently.
Yeah, love that. And if there's any consistency at all in these episodes that I'm putting out, and this has been especially true in the last year, Sarah, every single guest talks about building relationships as being an imperative, building relationships with students, and relationships by their very definition are messy. They're just very messy things. And accepting that messiness and embracing it and not feeling like you have to have some kind of authority over your kids in the classroom is a great start to that. I love that story. I think it says a lot about you and who you are. And so thank you for sharing that. Okay, so Sarah, as you know, I love to give guests the opportunity to shout out to the person or persons upon whose shoulders they stand, those giants, those mentors and guides and sponsors who moved mountains and who believed in you. And you listed a number of these giants. So let's take them one by one, meaning a short shout out to each one, right? Okay. So number one, Sarah, who is Scott Harvey and how did his strengths jive with your strengths?
Yeah, I've been so lucky in my career just to stumble across these people who allow me to be my best and then, complement that in such a way that makes me look better without me trying. So Scott Harvey was the choir director at Odessa High School for a period of time while I was there. And we put on several musicals together. And I just learned so much from him and his strengths and, choreography and building those relationships with students and just being an all-around handyman that allowed me to, not have to build those sets that I had absolutely no right to be trying to do.
That's awesome. So number two, who is Mike Shields? What did he teach you about individualized feedback?
So Mike Shields blew me away with how much time he dedicated to students after school. He taught the advanced courses in English at Odessa High School when I was there. And he just had never ending patience with students. I was blown away by how long he was willing to sit with students and just dive into their papers. And then I was able to recognize students are willing to do that. Like if you're willing to do that with them, they are willing to do that as well. And I was just so inspired by his work.
Yeah, patience. Oh, I love that story so much. It's just something, for me as a teacher, I think if I were to look back and just name one thing, Sarah, about who I was as a teacher, it was patience. I was a patient person. I did those kinds of things. And it just makes me feel good. Like I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the fact that I'm sort of a Mike Shields in a way. It makes me feel good. Okay, number three. In what ways do you carry Paula Dampier in your proverbial backpack each day?
Paula inspired me as a teacher because she made every day so much fun, but she's such a quick wit and so responsive to whatever you put in front of her. She's not afraid to tell you when you've done something wrong, knowing that you love feedback. So she appreciated in me my need for feedback and how much I abhorred just being told that everything was great. And perhaps a little evilly, I think she leaned into that quite a bit and got great joy out of pointing out what needed to be fixed or showing me where I'd messed up. And it was just such a great partnership with her because it made everything I was putting out there, whether written or visually, much stronger.
Wow, that's awesome. Okay, and finally, Sarah, who is Stephanie Russ and what energy do you draw from your collaborations with her?
I don't know if I've ever trusted an educator as much as I trust Stephanie Russ. She is both the media instructor at Enterprise and Design, the media coach, and also my partner in building the teacher network at Kauffman. I went to her knowing what a strong educator she was, and that she was doing such similar work in her classroom without such a spotlight shown on it, and asked her to please come on me with this journey. She jumped in with both feet and has really brought the perspective of how important it is for those teachers in elective classrooms to not just buy into this work, but to drive it, because it is those elective teachers that have the perspective of what joy learning can be for students. And I think they're separated away from core teachers so often, but that partnership just brings so much depth to what we can offer students. And not only that, but she is so entwined with her community and builds such great partnerships and works so professionally with people that I've just learned every single day with the way that she develops both relationships with adults, but then empowers students to tell great stories and, shape the way that we talk about the experiences that our students have.
That's fabulous. So, Stephanie, Paula, Mike, and Scott, you rock, and we're going to dedicate this episode to you. Those are just great stories. And thank you for sharing all of that about them, the giants upon whose shoulders you stand. So, Sarah Renfrow, thank you so much for the time today. Wow, I am just over the moon about real-world learning and the work that Kauffman is doing. It's very inspiring, and your story and the work that you've been doing is very inspiring. So I can't wait to get this episode out to our listeners. Thank you for the time today. And, we're almost at the end of a school year, so I hope that part isn't too nutty for you.
Yes, think of me over the next couple of weeks as we get these students graduated and on to the next big thing for them. I really appreciate you having me on.
Our editor, creative consultant, and sound engineer is the talented Evan Kurohara. Our theme music is created by a remarkable pianist, Michael Sloan. Producer of 12 albums with over 100 songs, Michael Sloan is featured in Apple Music, Spotify, and all major music platforms. You can also find his work on his YouTube channel. Michael has listeners in over 100 countries and 2,000 cities. We'd be grateful if you would support these episodes with leading edge, innovative and imaginative educators and students by giving us your own rating and writing a review wherever you get your podcasts. This series is sponsored by Education Change Agent, Ted Dintersmith, executive producer of the award-winning documentary film, Most Likely to Succeed, and author of the best-selling book, What School Could Be. If you are committed to rolling up your sleeves and joining thousands of educators, business professionals, nonprofit leaders, and parents as we reimagine education to be relevant and learner-centered, please join the What School Could Be global online community. Simply log in to community.whatschoolcouldbe.org or download the What School Could Be app from your favorite app store. The What School Could Be podcast is brought to you by Josh Rapoon Productions. Send your feedback to josh@whatschoolcouldbe.org. Follow the show on Twitter @WSCB Podcast and on LinkedIn @Josh Rapoon. Listeners, one of the most important things we all can do is to bring kindness and compassion into the world. For sure, we need a surplus of both right now. Until next time, ahui ho, and thank you for listening to the What School Could Be podcast.